Lanzinger, who is the Secretary-Treasurer of the BC Federation of Labour.
So I'm going to share with you my perspectives on this dispute from the point of view of someone who has been in the middle of very similar kinds of disputes and now has the distance of having been out of the BCTF for, I'm actually still a member on leave from Vancouver, but technically I've been working in another job for 3.5 years now. Pretty close contact with my pals at the BCTF, but I do feel some fairly significant level of distance from the dispute that I certainly haven't felt in the past. And I was thinking about the last time I was engaged in a dispute of this nature, and I have a couple of stories to share with you about my time in activism that I think illustrate some fundamental features of the kind of union the BCTF is. We had a 2-week illegal strike in 2005. I was the first vice president at the time. I think back on those 14 days as the longest 14 days of my life. So I have a lot of sympathy for Teri. It's not easy to be a full-time officer of the BCTF when you're on strike. It's a very crazy time. And it was an illegal strike. That strike ended. We had ready-made recommendations. We agreed to them. We didn't like them that much, but we agreed. The following June, we bargained in 2006, and we got a deal. It was, in my view, the only real bargaining that has ever occurred between there have been a few other deals. The last deal, we have had negotiated deals, but that deal, terrible process, but we bargained a deal in 2006, and we got 16% over 5 years, right? So it was a pretty good salary increase, not a bad deal. Didn't have class size and composition, but we got some other stuff that was good. The following year, about a year later, I ran for president of the BCTF. Ginny Sims was the president during our strike, and she had incredible prominence in the media because of the strike and because of other things. The BCTF is fairly prominent in the media on an ordinary day, let alone an illegal strike day. So everybody knew Ginny, and she was stepping down from the presidency. So when I won, it was fairly big news, and there was a media scrum. And one of the reporters said to me, "Are you going to be as much trouble as Ginny?" And I was very tempted to say, "You ain't seen nothing yet," but I didn't. I said what is actually the correct answer, and that is that the BCTF's been around for 95 years. We were formed in 1917. I don't know if my math's right there. It used to be 95. 1917, and we had our first strike in 1919. The fact is that the BCTF, whatever leadership is there, and there's been some variations in the politics of the leadership, to be sure, but we have always been an activist union, always. We have always, even when we weren't a trade union under the labor code, we took job action. We didn't know whether it was legal or not, but we did it. After I got elected, I was exhausted, as everybody always is at the end of the AGM, and I got in a cab to go home to my house in Burnaby. And the cab driver is driving there, and we're driving down the street, and he says, "You came from the BCTF AGM," because it was at the Hotel Vancouver in that particular year, and he knew that almost everybody at the hotel was staying at the AGM. And he said, "So who's the new president of the BCTF?" And I said, "Well, actually," it kind of dawned on me at that very moment, well, I am, right? But, these two stories are really, they say something about the BCTF. First, about that activism of the BCTF. We have always been an activist union. But secondly, it was now a year and a half after our strike. More than a year and a half. And that cab driver knew that there was an election at our AGM. Like, how prominent do you have to be that the cabbies in Vancouver know when there's an election at your AGM? So, we have a situation here where we have a very activist union, and I would also argue a union that's based, a very idealistic union. I'm going to come out and just say that. Like, teachers are fighting for their rights as workers, wages, benefits, their rights to strike, their rights to bargain. But they're also fighting for public education, right? And we believe that, and the public believes it, because it's true. We are fighting for public education. You are fighting for public education in this strike. So here you have an activist, probably one, and I know a lot of unions now and a lot of union leaders, and unions have different levels of activism, different levels of idealism. It's not right or wrong. It's just about culture. It's about the tactics you choose. It's what's about worked for you in the past. So there's a range here of tactics and levels of activism and idealism on the part of unions. So you take this union, the BCTF, on one side, and on the other side you put a government who in 2001, the very first thing they did, and I'm going to try not to steal too much of Iglika's thunder here, but was cut taxes by 25% and then proceeded to cut corporate taxes from 16% to 10%. They've now gone back up to 11. Billions of dollars in government revenue that is now not available for public services. So you've got the activist idealist union on one side, you've got a government that clearly does not support public services, cut public funding to a degree where, as an excuse to cut funding for public services. You've got a government that doesn't support public education, doesn't very much like unions, especially activist ones, and doesn't support workers' rights, stripped collective agreements, took away our right to strike, or tried to. That didn't really work very well. You know, the very first thing Gordon Campbell did in July, brought back the legislature to pass essential services legislation in July of 2001. So we've got a government that doesn't support unions, doesn't cut taxes, and can't fund public services even if they wanted to, because by their right-wing ideals they couldn't raise taxes, and doesn't like unions. And then you've got one of the most activist, idealistic unions on the other side. Hey, we have the recipe for trouble here. And we have had trouble. The BCTF has had trouble with this government from the very beginning. And so there are real polar opposites there in terms of the government and the BCTF. I want to talk just a little bit about the labor movement. So, as I said, in unions there's a range of activism and idealism on the part of unions, but all of those unions support the BCTF and will continue to for a couple of reasons. First of all, they support workers' rights. Secondly, whatever their tactics and level of idealism as unions are, they support public education and understand the role that public education plays. Their parents, they have kids, their grandparents, they understand the value of public education. So they will support the BCTF to the very end in this dispute. So you will have the support of the labor movement. It's a complicated dispute, but the principles are simple, right? We have to stick together, the BCTF and the rest of the labor movement and all of the allies that the BCTF will have, and if we stick together, we can win.